Hi, friends. I'm Father Kerry Walters, pastor of Holy Spirit American National Catholic Church, and this is another Holy Spirit moment, this one on the Engorged Self. We're entering into the final week of Lent. As you know, there are 3 traditional spiritual disciplines that are associated with Lent that we're encouraged to practice in Lent. They are prayer, almsgiving, and fasting. When we fast, what we try to do is to discriminate or discern between those objects of desire which are truly in our best interest and those objects of desire which are deceitful, which in point of fact will stunt our spiritual growth. I think that fasting is especially important if one recognizes that one of the primary temptations that we human beings are prone to is the engorgement of self. The refusal to fast in such a way that we don't bloat ourselves with ideas and opinions and modes of comportment that are simply unhealthy from a spiritual and moral perspective. And I think that the engorgement of self can take at least 3 different modes, that it can express itself in 3 different ways, each one deadlier than the one before it. Perhaps the lowest level of self-engorgement is our incessant need and desire and pursuit of simple pleasure. We desire to be titillated. We desire to be excited. We want our life to be filled with the pleasures that food and drink and sexuality can bring us. There's nothing wrong in and of itself with these kinds of pleasures. What goes wrong is when we insist upon them to the exclusion of everything else and gorge ourselves upon them. Not only will that make us dumb in a spiritual sense, that is, unable to speak truth or hear truth, but it also, after a while, is self-defeating. Because as Søren Kierkegaard pointed out in the 19th century in his analysis of the aesthetic way of life, pursuit of pleasure has to be constantly ratcheted up in intensity in order to remain satisfying. And after a point, we reach diminishing returns, and we become jaded and cynical. The second way in which we engorge ourselves is through trying to devour the world's resources. We are born, we creatures, with opposable thumbs, opposable digits, and that is a wonderful biological characteristic. It has enabled us to create civilizations. But as the 20th century philosopher Martin Heidegger pointed out, it also inclines us to approach the world as if the world is something that can be and ought to be clutched with our opposable thumbs. We develop, if you will, mental opposable thumbs that seem to try and imagine that the entire world is fruit ready for the plucking. And so we plunder the world's natural resources, looking at the world as simply a depository of ready-to-hand goods that we are somehow perfectly warranted in grabbing and utilizing. I don't think that there can be any doubt whatsoever among reasonable people that the environmental crisis we are now facing is because we have engorged the self with the world's resources, thinking that we just have a natural right to them and that we need not in any way whatsoever be concerned about exhausting them or giving anything back or even inhibiting our seizure of them. Now, as bad as these 2 modes of self-engorgement are, the third one, it seems to me, is the deadliest, the most tragic. It is a way of dissolving objectivity into subjectivity. We engorge the self by swallowing objectivity. Now, let me explain briefly what I mean by that. Beginning at least in the Enlightenment, human investigations of the world began to be divided up into the objective and the subjective. The objective realm, it was argued, could be best explored by science. The objective realm is what exists independently of us. It can be measured, it can be quantified, it can be evaluated, and it can be done so through the scientific methodology. The subjective realm, on the other hand, is the realm of private personal opinion, and that would include, for the Enlightenment thinkers, religion and ethics. It is all invented, if you will, principles and procedures and modes of behavior that have no objective reference in the real world, but are simply invented whole cloth from our subjectivity. Religion and ethics, as I just said, of course, were the prime candidates for this subjective realm. And even though many Christians at the time objected to subjectivizing and hence deflating religion and ethics, it became a pretty normal way of thinking about religion for the next 3 centuries, right up into the present day. Unfortunately, in the 19th century, the Romantic movement in Christianity, especially represented by the Protestant theologian Schleiermacher, kind of gave an imprimatur to this subjectivizing of religion. Religion was a feeling of intensity in relationship to God. Well, curiously enough, this reduction of any objective basis for religion into a purely private subjective realm began to spread. And before long, we were reducing even what scientists had earlier considered to be objectivity to the subjective. John Henry Newman in the 19th century writes about this strange metamorphosis, and so does C.S. Lewis in the 20th century. If you'll allow me, let me read a quick passage from C.S. Lewis, which I think wonderfully captures this bizarre migration from objectivity to total subjectivity. This is what Lewis writes. He said, "The advance of knowledge gradually empties the rich and genial universe. First, it rids us of gods, then of its colors, smells, sounds, and tastes, finally of solidity itself, as solidity was originally imagined at any rate. As these items are taken from the world, they are transferred to the subjective side of the account. They are all classified as sensations, thoughts, images, or emotions." I would suggest to you that before postmodernism actually came into its own as a way of looking at the world, Lewis nicely captures the dilemma of postmodernism, the radical subjectivization of what was once taken to be an objective realm, with, of course, religion and ethics being the most subjectivized of all previously objectified knowledge. When we do this, we engorge the self in a particularly horrendous way. We engorge the self with objectivity. We reduce it to nothing more than fantasy, than emotions and thoughts and sensations and theories and hypotheses, all of which are equally fragile, all of which are equally contingent, and none of which really tell us much about the world outside of ourselves. And in fact, it may be the case that even thinking about the possibility of a world outside of our subjectivisms is foolish. So at least goes this way of thinking, this logical consequence of the engorgement of self. As Christians, however, you and I know, don't we, that the world does exist independently of us, that truth is not purely a function of our subjective whimsy or fancy, that God can't be reduced to a mere sensation or perception, and that in order to live well-rounded, good lives, lives that are in accord with our own best interests and which are in accord with the will of God, what we need to do is to empty ourselves of our biases and our prejudices and our desires and our wants and face reality as the glorious and objectively independent thing that it is. Otherwise, we entomb ourselves in the engorged self. Please, I urge you to ask yourself in the remainder of Lent how far, if at all, you've fallen into the trap of self-engorgement, and ask God to help you depart from that self-imposed prison and step out into the real world of objective truth. I'm Father Kerry Walters, and this has been another Holy Spirit moment. Thank you so much. I will see you next time. I hope that you have a blessed remainder of Lent and an especially glorious resurrection.